All right, here's the final game, Chapter 3, the Panov Attack. In this one, we get to see the structure that I've really been waiting to cover, JD, when white takes on f6.
Yeah, and I think it's a structure that warrants some study because I think that it's it's to be played somewhat differently, and we make perhaps a couple awkward moves or two in this structure with this pawn on f6. And I alluded to this a couple of videos ago that these pawns really can just roll up the board and create lots of havoc. And there's some ideas where, oops, I didn't mean to do that, or maybe I was the game played. Um, but we have this idea sometimes of not there, but advancing this pawn up, kicking this knight, and letting us win the pawn even.
Yeah, so I think if you keep those two things in mind, you got the pressure on d4 and the pawn expansion on the king side. That'll kind of get you going in the right direction. And don't worry about that bishop on e6, right? We do have the bishop pair right now. He's doing a fine job guarding that isolated pawn on d5, right? So don't worry about the tall pawn temporarily. Bishop g7 was played. Bishop to b5, castle. And here we see bishop takes c6. And this is actually pretty common in these lines. White trades off the c6 knight to try to help relieve some of the pressure on the d4 pawn. But what happens after b takes c, we now have the b file to use for the rook.
Yeah, which the b file for the rook actually has some nice ideas because sometimes we can even, we lost this knight on c6, but maybe we're going to get a knight on b4, or sorry, not a knight, but a rook on b4. And we're just going to replace the knight with a different attacker. And yeah, I do think that this captures on c6 is perhaps showing why white is rated 1900, whereas our previous opponents were 2600 or so, and they're not making moves like this.
That's true. Yeah. So white's 1900 in this game. Black is 2300. That's a really good point. So after b takes c6, white could try here h3. The idea with h3 is we don't allow the bishop to come out to g4. So in the game, bishop g4 was played, and we'll cover that next. Black here still gets a lot of play. Rook to b8. Let's say queen to d2. And now, like we kind of talked about earlier, there's this idea h5, and you got to kind of keep all of these ideas in your memory bank for when you get these positions. Look at this plan: king h7, bishop h6.
Yeah, and just maybe we're just going to let the pawn sit on f6 so that white can't really move the knight from f3, and we'll just find a new diagonal to make our bishop active on.
Yeah, I like this position a lot. And I think there is still those chances of pushing the g pawn as well. I know it's pinned right now, but I can definitely envision like forces moving to the king side and attacking while our rook's sitting on the b file hitting queen side. We got a lot of play on both sides of the board.
And bishop f5 is maybe coming at some point. Like I think this feels quite comfortable for us. Where's our weakness? C6 is our only real weakness, and find a way to attack it in less than 5 moves.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the sad thing for white, I think, is white is sort of playing for this locked up position, right? We see the imbalance, two knights versus two bishops. White has these pawns locked up. But the problem is the whole board is not locked up. So we have both flanks to play on, and we have the d4 pawn to always keep an eye on as well. So there's definitely a lot that we can play for, and that gives black an advantage here. Even though at first glance, you might think, oh, white's doing okay with the board locked up in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree. So we play this bishop g4, natural move.
And bishop takes f3. We've seen this in other Caro-Kann chapters. The idea is, again, take away the defender of d4, weakest pawn on the board. Now it's an even bigger target, even though we gave up our bishop there.
Yeah, so f5, also the most natural move, and we're immediately threatening to win a pawn.
White defends, rook to b8. What have you
And now we're
noticed,
threatening to win
JD?
another pawn.
Yeah. What have you noticed about the initiative in these games?
We're always having the initiative, it feels like. Even the only time we didn't have the initiative was that game where we were up a pawn. And white had the initiative, but we had a pawn for it.
Yeah, the second Grandelius game. You're right. And I think that one was
So,
just an endgame grind. I almost think Niels wanted that type of endgame, like knowing that he could try to grind it out. All right, queen to a5,
I
sitting
like
very
that, but
active.
I also like the immediate rook to b4 and think that was worth looking at. It sort of forces this knight e2, which is awkward as all get out. And now we can just bring another piece into the B file, and it sort of forced B3, which I think is which is awkward. And here we just bring our other rook, and now it's like this feels like a very active position. We're going to go rook to E4, maybe even. And so white has to play A3 to kick our rook off B4. But now B3 seems kind of hopelessly weak, and we're still maybe going to play rook to E4, bring the other rook to the D file, or maybe play A5. I mean, I feel like we have lots of ideas here.
That's a really good point. I like how this kept with the theme of the position too. Every single move, I think white was trying to react to one of the threats. I think that was probably a nice improvement. Rook to B4 here instead of
I mean,
queen to A5.
A5 is a very similar idea, though. I mean, we're maybe the point with A5 was that I want to play rook B4 next, and then you don't have knight E2 because A2 is hanging.
I think that probably is the idea. Yeah. Because now white has to find a move like queen to F4, which honestly might even be harder to find than knight E2. So maybe black or white was more easily able to kind of stumble into the best line after rook to B4. Whereas this case, you give white this free move where it's like, well, what do you do now? Queen to F4? I don't know if that's that easy to find.
Yeah. And maybe, yeah, I think the natural way to stop rook to B4 was the move that white played, which is A3, which is just terrible. Because now we're with this, I love this rook to B3 idea because it means that the white pawns are fixed. They're never moving. And if white's going to get any play at all, it's always behind that play is always with B4, B5, and then they take on C3, and then they have this passer. That's white's play. And white's play is never going to happen now.
So white plays rook to D3 with the idea of knight to E2, trying to get trades in the position. Black's not too worried about that. Plays queen to A6, and there's no knight to E2 now because of this pin on the C3 knight. Really kind of a cool move, queen to A6.
Yeah, it is a nice move. And I like that it has some nice follow-ups that are going to happen too. When we bring the other rook to the file, we have some continued ideas. Like now we're just threatening to play like if we can triple, we'll maybe play like rook takes A3. We have tactics involved already.
And what I love about this is like, ignore what Stockfish says, right? Think of this as a real game. 1900s playing, 2300s playing, masters playing. There is so many ways that white can go wrong here. And this is something like I used to play the Benko Gambit quite a bit. You get these
Hmm.
type of queenside pressure positions all the time with the bishop on G7, and they're really hard to play for white in practice. Like even if white has a Stockfish advantage, which he doesn't here, these are really tough to play for white. Like you're just trying to guard everything at the same time.
Stockfish says that white's down a piece.
Yeah, this one's bad. This one's really bad. Okay, so rook d2, and now we see h5. Um, we've seen this idea before, but in this position, it's not as strong. This position did not call for h5 because it actually gives white the time he needs to reroute this knight with knight to a2, trying to trap our own rook on b3.
Yeah, if white had gone for this knight to a2, we have to pull our rook back, and then maybe they get the b4 plan that they're hoping for.
So what should black have done in this position?
Oh, I like queen to b7 because we're threatening rook takes knight and just outright winning material, and it's difficult to see a good way to try to handle that. And now we can maybe even play our h5 idea now that there is no knight to a2 because we'll just we can just win material.
Yeah, so it was like black was just one move away, one move, queen b7, from completely tying down white. But sometimes if you give your opponent a little bit too much flexibility, they can, lash out, get that counterplay going. That's what happened after h5. White did find the strongest move, knight a2, bishop to h6, hitting this rook on d2. That is the strongest move. And then white makes a mistake. Rook to c2, blocking the queen, so now she's not actually able to hit the rook on b3.
Yeah, and I mean, white still wanted to play. I mean, I think better would have been the immediate knight to b4, and this would have just forced some exchanges. We have to give up the exchange now. The pawn takes, and now we have to give up this, and then. But look, this is so much better for white. He's free. Okay, fine. You're maybe going to lose the b pawn, but maybe you can get counterplay against yeah, you can get your book to the seventh rank. Maybe you could have even played b5, and then after we take it, you get play on the a file against our a7 pawn. But the point is like you're not tied down. You have options now. Whereas maybe the options I just said are terrible, but you at least have options.
No,
Whereas before, there were no options.
and I don't think this is too bad for white actually, because you get into these situations where it's pawn for pawn back and forth, or maybe you get into a perpetual check type of situation. I think white
Hmm.
has some very good chances to draw this. Like let's just say rook e8 check, this king moves, and now put the queen on the e file. You can have this b pawn because you're actually going to lose your rook in the corner. So, right, white's all of a sudden getting a lot of play, and these dark squares are vulnerable around our king.
Yeah, I think that this is definitely the way that white should have gone.
But instead, rook to c2, keeping himself tied down, and now queen to b5 by black, getting that setup that black actually wanted a couple moves ago, tripling on the b file, and now again it's really hard for white to find a good move.
Yeah, I mean, if they just play knight back to c3, then we're just gonna uh, we have the exact same thing we wanted before, and it's just problems. It's trouble. It's not easy for them to know how to play. We're maybe if they're not careful, we're maybe going to get to take on a3 or c3 at some point, and take advantage of the pen that we have here. And this is just not comfortable.
And in the game, white played knight to b4, which is not quite as good as knight to c3, and it invites this move a5. And all of a sudden, the position's getting really bad for white. The knight has to go back to a2. That's the best move in the position, and who wants to play that? White makes another mistake. Rook to c3.
Yeah, after rook to c3, this just hangs a piece, right?
Yeah, takes.
Although we have to be a bit careful here. Maybe White was relying on this. So I've done this before myself, where I get a line that like this, and I just assume that White or that Black is going to have to take the knight, and then I'm like, haha, I got him. And then I overlook like this really nice in between move that Black finds here, which is to play Queen to b7.
And in
And
blitz, I feel like a lot of times your opponent just stumbles into it, right? Like they should have lost the piece. They deserve to lose it, and then they find the move in the end.
yeah, well, because from this situation, they think about this for a second. They go, "Oh, wait a second," and then maybe they didn't need to see the culprit moves earlier. The impetus was on White to see that this does. White had to find Queen B7 2-3 moves ago. Black didn't have to find it 2-3 moves ago.
Exactly. Yeah, there was no downside to this line for black. Queen to b7 though. Now the knight's going to be captured. Nothing white can do. Queen a4, takes. Rook a8 was played. This game goes a little bit deeper, JD, but I vote we stop here. And you can check out the PGN if you want to see the full game. But black's already up a piece and was able to very smoothly convert this one.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so what would you say was the key takeaway from this game from the black point of view?
So I think that the moment in this game where White transitioned the position when they took on c6, and knowing that that gave us the b file, and knowing that White's play is to try to advance those queenside pawns and just actively putting our pieces against them on this queenside plan, I think is the key idea here. And in combining this play on the queenside, halting White with some attacks on d4. Notice we didn't really talk about the d4 pawn very much in this game. We sort of we lined up more on the b file, and there was sort of this latent idea that d4 was maybe weak, and White had to think about it a bunch because there was times that we maybe could have done something with it. But I think this is the key idea, is that taking advantage of this point where White took on c6, allowing us to like strengthen our own d pawn and get to play on the b file.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that that D4 pawn was always just sitting there as like the secondary target, that target in the background while we focus so much on the B file. So I like this
If
game a lot too because it wasn't a GM playing from White's side. Like we got to see real players.
they just fell apart. I
And
do think that if White had made it to an end game, that d4 would have fallen.
yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just too hard to defend that pawn with the bishop sitting on G7.
But they didn't. They never got close to it in the game. Or
Yes,
when they did, they were already down a piece.
right. All right, so that concludes the chapter 3, the Panov Attack chapter. Next up, we have chapter 4, which is the exchange variation. So we'll see you guys in the next chapter.